Good day, students. This is lecture 6, and it really ends the first topic that we have looked at in the course on Western philosophy. Generally, you can name the topic the Greek miracle. But this evening, I'm talking about the very end of that cycle of philosophical development. And I'm dealing with the sort of closure of the Greek or the Hellenistic world. And that takes us really into the era of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire supplanted the Greek Empire, but it still remained culturally located within the Hellenistic intellectual and cultural environment. The Romans were wise enough to know that the Greeks had a lot to offer. And even though their military campaigns were successful against the Greeks, and they were able, by the middle of the 1st century BC, to conquer very much of the Syrian sector of the Greek Empire. And by the 3rd decade of that century, around 31 BC, they were able to capture the Egyptian section based in Alexandria. That's associated with the famous story of Antony and Cleopatra, when Cleopatra was the last Greek empress to rule in the empire. And later on, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, right? So that you can date the initiation or the commencement of the Roman Empire from about the 3rd century BC, the third decade, right? Of that century, that last century BC. The Roman world was a very interesting world, and as I said, they were now the masters of the Greeks. Very often they employed the Greeks as slaves, and often the slaves were their teachers, right? They would employ a Greek scholar who was a slave now to teach their children. And so it was really still Greek education, and to a large extent, the lingua franca of the new Roman Empire was still very much Greek. That's very interesting because Latin, which is the Roman language, only replaced Greek at the end of the Roman Empire, right? On the last era of the Roman Empire. Rome, to a large extent, still continued to employ the Greek language, so that Greek culture still remained in the ascendancy. Now, the reason why I felt I should spend some time on the Roman Empire is because it is also of tremendous interest to all of you who are doing theology. That was the time when Christ was born. Julius Caesar, in a way, had been able to establish the foundations of the empire. But the first great emperor, he was immediately assassinated by Brutus. I think everybody knows the story from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And he was succeeded by Augustus. And it was during the reign of Augustus that Christ was born. Christ was born within the Roman Empire. Right? Palestine, Syria was merely a small province within that empire. And so they paid their taxes to the Romans. They were subservient to them. The emperor ruled, right, the entire domain. And the Roman Empire, in a way, extended as along a range of territories that was as expansive as the Greeks. The Greeks had reached India, the Romans hadn't reached India. The limit of the Roman Empire really was the Tigris-Euphrates Valley region. They did not penetrate into Persia as the Greeks had done. The Greeks had conquered the Persians. The Romans didn't penetrate into Persia. So Parthia remained an Eastern empire that Rome had to negotiate with and very often fight against. But that was the limit of the empire in the East. In the West, the empire stretched to Spain, right? It entailed all of North Africa, That's north of the Sahara. So Egypt and Libya, all of these territories were now within the Roman Empire, all of North Africa. The entire Mediterranean region, right, was controlled by Rome. Long before they had destroyed and they had conquered the Carthaginians under Hannibal, so that the Carthaginian world was now ruled by Rome. And it stretched northward into Germany and into Britain. Right? Britain was the far limit of the empire. That was the most westerly portion of the empire. In fact, you can still go to Britain and see the wall that demarcates the Roman section of Britain. So Rome was an extensive empire. And what is remarkable is that Rome was able to maintain her control over that empire for well over 300-400 years. Right? That was a remarkable achievement. One of the reasons why I think the Romans were able to maintain that control is because of the tremendous advancement in civilization, in technology, in trade and commerce that was now affordable. And the fact that Rome was the Romans were generally a very generous people in that once you didn't disturb the empire, once you didn't foment insurrection within the empire, then Rome left you alone and you were allowed to enjoy full religious freedom. The only thing that the Romans insisted on was that you should recognize the emperor as a god. There was an emperor cult. And all of the nationalities were supposed to pay homage to the emperor. The only people who resisted doing that were the Jews. And again, the Romans were quite generous to the Jews. And eventually the Christians, because Christianity emerged out of Judaism and still in that early period remained a part of Judaism, they also enjoyed that measure of Roman generosity. The Romans said, okay, you're not going to worship the emperor, but at least pray for the emperor. And that is why you find in Paul's writings references made to respecting the emperor and praying for the government and so on. So that was a beautiful compromise that allowed the Jews to maintain, their religious integrity, their faith to Yahweh, and still remain very good Roman citizens. A number of Jews sought Roman citizenship, and as you know, Paul always boasted that he was a Roman citizen. He always flashed, well, it wasn't a visa, but it's equivalent to what would be a visa today. He flashed his visa in the face of officials when they tried to interrupt his work. So a number of them sought Roman citizenship. The reality was that throughout the Roman Empire, there were large communities of Jews living. You had a massive Jewish population in Alexandria in Egypt, for example. And a lot of very important work was taking place there among the Jewish rabbis. You also had a large community in Babylonia, and that was outside the empire. But in Babylonia, you also had a large community of Jewish writers who were really consolidating the literature. The whole question of the canonization of the literature took place during this period. So the nations that were controlled by Rome, the nations that were part of the empire, enjoyed a considerable amount of peace. And in fact, that whole period is referred to as the period of the Roman peace. The Pax Romana, PAX is the Latin for peace, Romana, Roman, the Roman peace. And a lot was achieved during that period. A lot of the new massive architectural constructions. The Romans continued to build, theaters and colosseum, very similar to what the Greeks had been doing. They learned from the Greeks and they copied the Greeks. They went beyond the Greeks. Right? They built a number of aqueducts. Now, the aqueduct was a very significant technological advancement because it brought water into the city. And when water came into the city, then people could enjoy a fairly civilized lifestyle. You didn't have to walk for miles to fetch water by the river. The water came into your homes, into your workplaces. The aqueducts brought that water down from the mountainside into the city. So you still have remains of Roman aqueducts throughout Western Europe and in North Africa and places like these. So the Romans had brought really a civilized lifestyle. The Pax Romana, for example, allowed Roman citizens to be able to send letters, to post letters to people. The sending of letters was not a new thing. I think the Persians had been able to, to initiate practices of that nature, but it was during the Pax Romana, with the amount of trade that was taking place, the communication linkages that were established, the trade networks that were established, boats going to and fro along the Mediterranean. And not only were goods transported, but letters were also sent. And that is why the letter became so very important as a new literary form for the recording of philosophical ideas, for the transmission of knowledge and so on. The New Testament is a compilation of letters, right? That's what it is. You don't have anything like that in the Old Testament. The Old Testament has hymns and psalms and so on and proverbs, but the New Testament is a compilation of letters written by apostolic writers and sent to Christian communities. And that's because letters could be sent. Letters could not be sent in a time of war. Right? Letters had to be, that is a technology and that is a practice that was only feasible within the ambit of a civilized community that was enjoying considerable peace and tranquility. And so you find Roman writers also were tremendous letter writers. I will make reference to people like Cicero and Seneca and so on, but these were also men who wrote a lot of letters, right? And Pliny and so on. The letter writing became the new form of writing, referred to as the epistolary form. And so that allowed for a considerable degree of communication, transmission of ideas, the influencing of people. If you look at Paul's letters, for example, his letter to the Romans, even before he visited Rome, he was able to write a letter to the Romans, answering some of the questions that they wanted answered. And that became, the essence of Christian doctrine in that early period. I mean, you can hardly find a single book that contains, that whole compilation of fundamental Christian theology as the book of Romans does. And that's a letter to the Romans. So the Roman Empire really had a lot to offer. There's a sense in which, however, the Romans were far more barbaric than the Greeks, and they didn't lose any of their barbarism. Suppose one of the reasons why they were able to sustain their military ascendancy was precisely because of that barbarism. They were ruthless soldiers, and when you get the record of the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of Masada and the wiping out of the Jewish people, you realize the kinds of fighters they were. They were really ruthless fighters. And so whereas the Greeks were known for their Olympic Games, I mean, there could hardly be a more civilized cultural practice than the emergence of the games, of the Olympic Games. All Greek cities sent their athletes either to Olympus or in a number of other games. Every 4 years, they would go in the case of the Olympics, every 4 years, and they would contest against each other. That was an enormously civilized lifestyle. We see its repetition today. Right? For the last 100 or odd years, we have resurrected the Olympic Games. And to a large extent, it is the sustenance of the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup that is able to maintain harmony, right, among the nations of the world, able to maintain peaceful relations and goodwill among the nations of the world, even though they are contesting against each other. Very important sports, yet they are able to maintain that goodwill. And so you find that the Greeks were known for that. The Romans, on the other hand, had a different kind of sports. The Olympic Games still continue. They didn't discontinue Olympic Games in the Greek territory, but in Roman territories, you found in the massive arenas like the Colosseum and so on. The Colosseum is still standing in Rome today. You find it in these massive arenas. There were gladiatorial contests where gladiators who were slaves trained to fight with weapons, with swords and so on, battle axes and so on, were put in the arena and they were made to fight to the death. But that was a frightful thing, you know, and there would be people cheering on and indicating very often with a show of their hands whether the contestant who was overpowered should be killed or not. Very often the gladiator who was a conqueror would thrust his spear into his heart and end his life. They were slaves, so their lives didn't matter at all to the Romans. So you find that a lot of those sports were very deadly sports. The Romans were known for crucifying people. And it is said that very often if there was an insurrection along the way, anybody who challenged the empire, the political control of the empire, these were people who would be crucified on crosses. That's why Christ was crucified, because these were people who would challenge the empire as far as the charges were concerned. So there was still a tremendous amount of barbarism among the Romans. But they had acquired and they had cultivated Greek philosophical ideas. And Rome was willing to learn. The Romans had very significant thinkers. In fact, they produced a number of great poets, right? People like Virgil, and who wrote the Aeneid. And you had Horace writing a number of odes and so on. They were great Roman poets. A number of very good literary men, dramatists and so on. Seneca himself was a dramatist. So there was a significant amount of writing that came out of the Roman Empire. But the Romans practiced the Greek traditions, right? Their leading thinkers were included men like Cicero, who was a rhetorician. And Cicero was a tremendous orator, tremendous speaker, and had a very powerful impact on his audiences. And he was one of the leading politicians of his day, right? He lived around the 4th or 5th century before Christ. Not that century, sorry, the 4th or 5th decade before Christ. And then you had Seneca, right? Seneca lived during the time of Christ. He would have been a younger contemporary. Seneca was also a tremendous writer. Seneca, for example, was a Stoic. Stoicism was very fashionable among the Romans. We talked about Stoicism last day because Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged as Greek philosophical ideas or systems of thought that were not only oriented to intellectual reflection, but in addition to one's moral lifestyle, they had an ethical significance, and people, a lot of thinking people gravitated to them. These were schools that survived into the Roman Empire, and a number of Romans, in fact, some of the great Roman Stoics filled very important positions in Rome. One, Marcus Aurelius, for example, was a Roman emperor, and he was also a Stoic philosopher. And you had people like Epictetus, who was a slave, but he was also a famous writer, a writer that produced a number of significant Stoic works. So Stoicism and Epicureanism, Platonism and Aristotelianism still survived in the Roman Empire. And there were Romans who could afford to go across to Athens to study in the universities that had been established here, which I mentioned before. Neoplatonism, a number of the Romans were quite skeptical. Skepticism was sort of prevalent among the intelligentsia, right? The educated or the literary classes, right? There's skepticism, the denial of most things religious, the denial of most things metaphysical, the acceptance of only what one had empirical evidence for, very often was the position of the Roman thinker, the Roman citizen, the educated Roman citizen. So the Roman Empire, therefore, was an empire in which there were a lot of thought movements, very clear. But religion thrived in the Roman Empire, and many of the religions coming from Asia found, ready audiences. Religions like Mithraism, which again has its origins in Persia. Mithraism was a very solid competitor to Christianity in the early days, up to about the 3rd century. They were both Sunday keeping religions. Christianity and Mithraism were both Sunday keeping religions, and they were in stiff competition with each other. And then you had things, Gnosticism, which we referred to last day. Gnosticism also thrived in the empire. Manichaeism, and when we get to the next topic, when we come to the Middle Ages, we'll see that Manichaeism produced a thinker who, when he was converted to Christianity, became Christianity's greatest theologian. Up to now, he is still regarded as perhaps the greatest theologian of the Christian faith. So a lot of the thought movements that originated among the Greeks survived among the Romans. The Romans were able to, to sustain Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, and to a large extent, it thrived among them. Now, the Roman Empire lasted for, as I said, quite a long time. It is only by the 5th century that one began to recognize fissures in the empire, weak lines of weakness, and the empire began to collapse. Now, a lot of times we talk about the ending of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The date generally given for the end of the Roman Empire is the date 476 AD. Right? But one of the interesting things about what happened in the latter part of the Roman Empire is that Christianity rose in ascendancy. And the reason why Christianity was able to take rise and became so very popular among Europeans is because Christianity had been able really to establish itself in the great urban centers of the Roman Empire, and eventually was able to win and convert, the Christians were able to convert a Roman emperor, Constantine. Now remember that this was a time when, when you look at ancient history, all of ancient history, the religion of the king defined the religion of the people. Once your king belonged to a particular faith, people gravitated to that faith. In fact, in some instances, the kings would insist on it. They would compel you to gravitate to that faith. But generally, people followed the religion of their kings, of their sovereigns, of the emperors. And it was by the early part of the 4th century, the first 3 decades of the 4th century, where the rise, when Constantine won, in fact, he won a number of battles, having adopted the Christian cross as his emblem. The Roman Empire became to a large extent Christian. Now, Christianity had made tremendous strides during the earlier centuries. Judaism did not, right? One of the problems that the Jews faced was the problem of prophecy. When they read their prophecies, they expected that a Messiah would come to liberate them. And according to the interpretations of prophecies, especially in the book of Daniel, they identified, that 1st century period as a period when that Messiah would come to save them. And there were a number of messiahs that emerged. Christ wasn't the only one, right? Barabbas was a messiah figure. We talk about Barabbas as a thief, but Barabbas was really a zealot. His name means son of the father. So clearly he was highly recognized. And remember that when the crowd asks who you want, Barabbas or Christ, they said Barabbas, because they felt that Barabbas was willing to fight a real battle for them, so that they will gain they would gain salvation from Roman hegemony. So there were a number of Messiah figures all over. And the most dangerous of all really was a Messiah figure that arose just around 70 AD in Jerusalem, and who initiated the revolt in Jerusalem against the Romans. Right? Remember that they talk about Christ predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. And that destruction of Jerusalem was the result of the fact that the Jews were made to believe that here they had a Messiah figure who would deliver them from Roman hegemony, Roman exploitation, Roman governance, and who would establish the kingdom of God on earth. They couldn't believe that that would not happen. Their prophecies seemed to have pointed to that period, and therefore they rebelled against Rome. Rome was not tolerant of that, any rebellion. And the Romans used them as an example to any nation that dared to rebel against them. They wiped the Jews off the face of the earth, almost literally. Not only did they destroy Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple. They took the 7 candlesticks and carried it to Rome, among other things. They burnt it down. They entered the most holy place. Right? Not only did they do that, but they spent 3 years besieging Masada after they had conquered the whole of Israel. One little group remained in Masada, and they would not allow them to survive. They spent 2 years besieging Masada, and eventually were able to build scaffolds to climb the mountain and wipe the, well, when they entered Masada, the inmates of the camp there committed suicide. So the Romans would not be able to enjoy the pleasure of massacring them. So Israel no longer was the home of the Jews, or Judea was no longer the home of the Jews, Palestine, if you wish. And the Jews had to flee. Many of them went across into the Parthian Empire, went down into Babylonia, where they were fairly safe and could continue practicing their religions. Right? Eventually, there was another Jewish revolt in 135 AD. Bar Kokhba, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And again, the Romans had to wipe them out. This time, it was a final wiping out. And the Romans decided to ban, on the pain of death, they banned the practice of, circumcision. The Jews could no longer practice circumcision, and they banned the keeping of the Sabbath. That's a very important date, period of 130, 140, because it was then that the Christian church turned to worshiping on Sunday. Very often we say Constantine established the Sunday law, and we blame Constantine for Christian Sunday worship. That is historically an error. The Christian church became a Sunday keeping church from about 150 AD, long before Constantine. Constantine was 224, 225, right? So the Christians survived by switching their religious celebrations to Sunday, Eucharistic meal, and the Jews had to escape and go across again to Babylonia in order to maintain their religious and cultural traditions. The Christians had nowhere to go. They were Gentiles. They were living in the Roman Empire. They were Greek-speaking people, or perhaps Latin-speaking people. So these are some of the incidents that took place within that Roman Empire that are of some significance in terms of a historical background. But Christianity now began to thrive. There were major centers of Christianity right within the Roman Empire. Alexandria being perhaps the greatest. Not Rome, but Alexandria. Alexandria was the home of Greek scholarship and Greek science and so on. It was a place where Philo had been writing. Philo was a contemporary of Christ, and he was trying to synthesize Platonic philosophy with Hebrew scholarship and Hebrew religious ideas, right? The writings of the Bible, a very significant intellectual development. Philo is somebody that I imagine you would encounter in your study of historical theology. He was not a Christian; he was a Jew, right? But he did a lot to establish a kind of model for theological thinking, and the Christian community, learned from that, And Alexandria produced some of the greatest theologians of the early church, men like Origen and Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, right? These were all Alexandrians. These were based in Alexandria, and they were writing significant theology. They were doing a lot of that kind of synthesizing work that became characteristic of Christian theologians later on. When we come to the Middle Ages, which is the next topic, you will see how significant that was, right? And then another center of Christianity was Antioch. Again, that was the capital of the Syrian Empire, Antioch. And so they produced also a number of very, very celebrated theologians. They were all writing in Greek. Eventually in Rome became one of the major centers. And what Constantine did was that Constantine went to Byzantium to establish his palace. He wasn't too happy living in Rome. Byzantium was a far more celebrated, far more renowned, far more civilized and sophisticated urban community and center. And so he chose to live there and left his son and so on and other officials to run the Western Empire. And he established himself in the Eastern Empire. So that the Roman Empire was now split in two, right? Between Rome on the one hand and Byzantium, which came to be called Constantinople on the other. That's where Istanbul is now in modern Turkey. So the Roman Empire lasted. In fact, the Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire lasted until the 15th century AD. It was in 1450s that the Eastern Empire fell. It fell to the Turks. But the Western Empire fell by 1,000 years earlier, right? And by 476, the Western Empire had fallen to the barbarians. Now, what was happening was that the barbarians were descending on the Roman Empire. Caesar had conquered the Gauls, he had conquered the Franks, he had conquered the Goths, and so on. The empire was established here and they extracted revenue and taxation from all of these nations. But what happened was that now, by the 5th century, they were now coming down into Rome, coming down into the civilized world, and they were rampaging that world. Massacres, destruction, burnings, and so on. The only thing, one of the interesting things is as they descended on the Roman Empire, and it was the Gothics mainly, you also had Asiatics coming, Huns and so on coming, people like Attila and so on coming down from Asia and launching the attacks on the Roman Empire. But it was the Goths that eventually became the most destructive force. But in coming down into the southern part, Mediterranean world, many of them were converted to Christianity. And so it's very interesting to see how they were so very destructive, but very often refused to touch the Christian monasteries where the monks lived. They respected the monasteries. And that was a very significant development because it meant that a lot of Roman, Hellenistic, Greek, and Christian culture could survive in these monasteries. And the monasteries now became the conduit for a civilized lifestyle and civilized ways of thinking and behaving, right, that eventually were transmitted to Western Europe after the threat of the barbarian invasions and laid the basis for the formation of Western European civilization. So this is a very, very significant period, and it's not, there's a sense in which, you know, it doesn't reveal anything new in terms of philosophical ideas, but it is a very significant background that one has to see the development and the survival of Greek philosophical thinking, right, against very important background. So I think I will end here. As I said before, this brings us to the end of topic 1, the Greek miracle. It's the biggest topic of all. And the next topic that I'll be going to will be the Middle Ages.